Hello, welcome to Virus Bulletin Localhost, where today I will talk about the baffling Berserk Bear, a decade's activity targeting critical infrastructure. So first, who am I? My name is Joe Slowik. Currently, I lead detections and cyber threat intelligence for network security monitoring company Gigamon. Previously, I performed threat intelligence research for domain tools in Dragos, and then had a fairly extensive career in the US government, spread between Los Alamos National Laboratory as well as the US Navy. Now, for our agenda today, we'll begin with some introduction to what Berserk Bear is or what that means, and then we'll move into the Dragonfly campaign when this group first came to anyone's notice. Then talk about a potential disruptive or even actually outright destructive incident that this entity may have been involved in. Then move into some more recent activity, such as the Dragonfly 2.0 and Palmetto Fusion campaigns, some present actions that this group is likely linked to, and then close with some lessons and concerns for how this entity has acted or operated over the last 10 years. So first, Berserk Bear is one of many names, and as we know in this industry, we have an issue with naming conventions sometimes. So other terms that you may be used to for what we'll talk about today include Crouching Yeti, Dragonfly, Dragonfly 2.0, Alanite, Dimaloy, Energetic Bear, etc. To avoid confusion and because it is fairly uncontroversial to link these entities together, we'll refer to these various clusters of activity which can be shown to relate to one another as Berserk Bear, or just simply Berserk for short. And this entity has been active for quite some time, starting no later than 2010 and potentially somewhat earlier with the initial Dragonfly intrusions, going through a potential retooling period in 2015, and then starting up again with follow-on campaigns from 2016 and continuing to the present, with various behaviors and continuity of certain behaviors and tendencies, allowing us to link these campaigns together as likely belonging to or associated with the same entity throughout this history. So let's dive into some of these activities and what they mean and how they were executed, and really start exploring what Berserk Bear means and what they've been responsible for over the years. Well, this group first came to prominence, or at least we first started getting glimpses of what this entity was up to through some reporting from Symantec and Kaspersky in 2014, identifying the Dragonfly campaign, as well as much more extensive activity noted by Kaspersky under Crouching Yeti. And this identified a number of activities, including operations against the manufacturing sector, energy, oil and gas, as well as potentially some other targets associated with more standard espionage activity, which then more or less stopped in 2014 following disclosure by these vendors, among others. What's interesting about this campaign is that there were multiple vectors used in order to launch payloads within victim environments. So there was a phishing vector that was used to execute code on victims, a strategic website compromise component also used to gain code execution for deployment of follow-on tools. And then most interestingly, a software supply chain compromise vector, which is the one that we'll focus on in this discussion. There's additional information about these other vectors in the accompanying paper for this presentation if you're interested. But in almost all cases, these vectors all led to the same destination: deployment of Havoc's malware within the victim environment. Now, the supply chain vector is quite interesting, as it is also very narrowly focused on software payloads that are associated with industrial control system operations or operational technology environments, specifically targeting equipment from E1, NB Connect line, and a now no longer existing, at least not as an independent company, Mesa Imaging Software. All of these related to relatively small, fairly niche industrial applications instead of targeting a major original equipment manufacturer like a Siemens or a Honeywell or something. So really displaying a certain level of selectivity or focus in terms of who would be impacted by these operations. What's also interesting is that this is an overwhelming focus on European victims in terms of both the users of these applications, as well as in the case of MB Connect Line, where only a European version of the software was impacted when the attacker presumably would have been able to modify both a European and a North American version of the same software if they so chose to do so. Now, looking at the methodology, we certainly see an initial identification of a vendor of interest. So we already named the three in question with several product lines impacted. And then rather than like we've seen in cases like the SolarWinds incident with Sunburst malware, where actual source code level modifications were made and development environment modifications were made, instead what it appears the adversaries did in this case was not gain access to source code in similar repositories, but rather the adversary appeared to just compromise the file download portal, where the vendors were serving up installation packages to users and other entities, and then replaced the legitimate download with a modified package so that the malware, in this case, either Havex or an intermediate loader leading to Havex, would execute as part of the modified installation package. And we can see that when we dive into the actual binaries involved. So looking on the left here, we see the legitimate NB check installation binary, which is German language. It is a fairly standard PE32 executable, nothing really standing out there. But then looking at a malicious version of the same software on the right, we see a number of changes to the item in question. Among other things, we see that we're no longer dealing with just a straight PE32, but rather looking at a nullsoft installer package. And we can see that reflected in the section headers, such as the end data header with the very large virtual size and non-existent raw size, showing us signs of packing or et cetera, as well as seeing the shift from the German language to the English language for the development language. So very noticeable differences, as long as you're actually looking for them, in how these items were put together. And this was the mechanism through which the supply chain intrusion took place. Now, the ultimate payload for all of these was Havex, which was delivered following either intermediate tools or other infection vectors, in some cases through a very direct infection vector. And it was a modular framework, or it is still a modular framework, in that capabilities are added as needed and that can enable a variety of follow-on capabilities if one so chooses to do so. What's interesting about Havex, though, is that there were very specific industrial control system targeting capabilities, including port scanning functionality that included hard-coded ports only for a variety of fairly specific industrial services, as well as a scanning module for OPC servers in order to enumerate the OPC server and its various subcomponents and return information from them. So all sort of survey, reconnaissance, and intelligence gathering items, but nothing, at least that represents a deliberate attempt to create a disruptive ICS capability, although we'll revisit that in a moment here. And as far as victimology was concerned, throughout all of this campaign, most vendors are pretty confident in identifying activity in Europe and North America, although it's interesting, some other entities with different types of visibility also identified potential victims in Russia, as well as potential outliers. And that applies to industries as well, where we saw significant activity targeting the energy and manufacturing verticals, but also some possibilities of victimology in the education field and potential outliers into more traditional espionage victims as well, although not as strong evidence publicly available that would support those claims. And then from an impact perspective, we see a large focus on information gathering and potentially developing access to some fairly sensitive environments. But that leaves open the question that since we're talking about operations in fairly sensitive networking environments, what happens if something goes wrong? And that takes us to something that has been kind of a mystery in the industrial control system security space for quite some time. In 2014, the German domestic security agency, BSI, released a report on a disruptive event that impacted a steel mill within Germany that resulted in physical damage to that facility as a result of what BSI noted was a cyber intrusion. That was since then picked up in media sources by Kim Zetter writing for Wired at the time and other items, but no real solid evidence ever was released by BSI or identified by others, identifying, among other things, who was responsible for this event and what sort of capability may have produced this destructive event at an industrial facility. Well, if we start looking at this in line with what we just talked about in terms of Dragonfly, we see some overlaps that, while it doesn't definitively assign attribution for this event, can strongly indicate a potential for Berserk Bear through the Dragonfly campaign executing or inadvertently causing this incident. So if we look at the targeting and timing in question, we know already that Dragonfly was extensively targeting European manufacturing operations, and the most significant industrial activity, such as the supply chain compromises we talked about, took place after 2013. From a methodology perspective, there are some overlaps with what BSI very broadly described, as well as Dragonfly operations or Dragonfly campaign observations, and certainly some follow-on Berserk activity in campaigns we'll talk about later. And then we have the ICS specific capabilities, such as this Havoc's OPC module and the port scanner, but there's no known ICS impact module. So yes, maybe during the Dragonfly campaign, Berserk was in this environment, but they don't have a capability to cause a disruptive or destructive effect, right? Well, not quite, because through subsequent analysis of the OPC enumeration payload within Havoc's, US CERT, ICS CERT, now CISA, identified that the Havoc's payload could cause OPC platforms to crash inadvertently. While this is a software item, at the same time, we're talking about control system software linking to a physical process that, if that software terminates in a less than graceful fashion or less than controlled fashion, could create the possibility of inadvertent side effects. And that starts taking us into areas where things can get a little interesting. So since we've already established that there are potential overlaps in targeting geography and timing, the capability component of Dragonfly leads to an interesting observation that in the process of deploying an industrial surveillance and reconnaissance tool, the tool may have caused an inadvertent crash within the victim environment, resulting in follow-on process instability. That process instability leads to subsequent process malfunction, which could produce an industrial accident in a worst-case scenario. Now, in many cases, in most environments, there are a number of security and engineering controls that should mitigate against this sort of activity taking place, but we don't know. And thus, there's the possibility for the Dragonfly campaign to be associated with an accidental disruption in an industrial environment. Certainly something that would be very interesting to see further evidence come to light so that we could really determine on a more certain basis of what just happened here. But based on the evidence that is available, there's a strong case to make that this steel mill incident may have just been a Dragonfly campaign screw up, resulting in physical damage and quite extensive disruption in the victim environment. Well, that aside, Berserk went away for about a year, didn't seem to be very active in 2015 after being exposed in 2014, but then came back not that long after with a follow-on campaign called Dragonfly 2.0 by Symantec, which showed a lot of the same sorts of techniques that were observed in the earlier Dragonfly campaign. So among other items, there was some overlap in certain tools and malware families between the Dragonfly campaign and Dragonfly 2.0 campaigns, additional focus on the energy sector, although largely in Europe and Turkey, at least for the Dragonfly 2.0 portion of activities, as well as using phishing. But instead of using phishing in the same fashion as in the original Dragonfly campaign, the 2.0 variant moved to phishing items such as this, spoofing a holiday party invitation and whatnot, but rather what we saw with malicious PDFs used in Dragonfly that led to code execution, the 2.0 variant instead causes credential leakage from the environment by trying to create an external SMB connection that will also leak a authentication attempt to a listening external device running something like Responder or whatnot in order to capture those credentials. So what we see is phishing with credential leaks, targeting victims, as well as some strategic website compromise that then leads to deploying malware in the victim environment. And again, a focus on information gathering, access development, and no known intentional disruptive incidents. Moving a little further in time, so whereas Dragonfly 2.0 appeared to be active from potentially as early as very late 2015 through early 2017, targeting Europe, Turkey, and similar areas, from 2017 through 2019 and potentially 2020, another campaign fired up, referred to initially as Palmetto Fusion by the US government, that was targeting the electric sector in the United States, United Kingdom, and possibly in some other regions as well. This relied on some similar capabilities as Dragonfly 2.0, but really moves away from some of the use of custom malware or even compiled binaries as part of the intrusion process. Instead, we see a very indirect sort of campaign that first focused on identifying contractors and other entities for intermediate phishing, and then using the trust relationship between those contractors and ultimate victims to send follow-on phishing emails that would then cause the initial leak of credentials, which adversaries would use to then remotely access victim environments, continuously capture credentials through publicly available tools like Mimikatz and PowerShell scripts available on GitHub and whatnot, use common tools and living off the land binaries to develop access, exfiltrate info, but again, no observed impacts or other scenarios. However, from a Palmetto Fusion perspective, we did see direct access to control system environments. So this screenshot was provided by the United States CISA as part of their investigation, showing that the Palmetto Fusion actor, which links to Berserk Bear activity, was able to access a human-machine interface within an industrial environment. From this access point, they could have done something as simple as just turn something off or change settings, resulting in a fairly ham-fisted but still very concerning impact on the environment. And with further analysis done by journalists from the Wall Street Journal, Rebecca Smith and Rob Berry, we see that this campaign was quite widespread within the United States, at least, as well as potentially impacting other countries, targeting a variety of utilities across the country, and in many cases getting at least access to the IT environments of these organizations, and as shown in the previous slide, potentially getting access to more sensitive OT environments as well. So definitely something to be concerned of. As far as continuity is concerned, we see an interesting iteration of activity over time, from the initial Dragonfly activity, where the use of exploits and custom malware was leveraged in order to facilitate intrusions, to Dragonfly 2.0, which used credential harvesting for initial access, but then deployed some of the same custom tools or very similar custom tools as observed in the original Dragonfly campaign, and then getting into Palmetto Fusion, where we drop all of the custom tooling and compiled binaries entirely, and instead leverage credential capture in combination with living off the land techniques in order to progress further. So it's almost like an A to B to C, with all of this over time showing a maturation, or at least an evolution, by the Berserk actor through several campaigns as far as their methodology is concerned. But what have they been up to lately? Well, more recently, starting in 2019, first there was observed, beginning right around the time the Ukrainian presidential elections were taking place, campaigns targeting a variety of entities in Ukraine, from energy providers to news websites to even the FC Dynamo football club in Kiev, and using some of the same sort of credential leak activities that were observed in the Palmetto Fusion and Dragonfly 2.0 campaigns. No real additional information on this, unfortunately, and some of these targets are pretty wide in terms of the number of entities that they would be able to target or potentially leak information on. So a little ambiguous as far as what's going on here, but certainly seeing something that reflects potential interest by Russian strategic interests, which are linked, or which Berserk is linked to, and mapping to an interesting geopolitical event in terms of that election life cycle. But then we also saw in 2020 similar activities show up in the United States, initially linked to San Francisco International Airport, where a web page and then a mirrored resource of that same web page featured an injection shown here from a tweet from ESET of the same sort of strategic website compromise observed in the Palmetto Fusion campaign, and then spreading to over a dozen additional airports within the United States. And in this case, not really targeting the airport per se, but rather using the airport as a means to then target visitors to that airport's website in order to try to gain follow-on access to those victims' machines. And then most recently, and the last we've really seen of these entities, there were reports from US government sources in late 2020 that unspecified intruders were attempting to gain access to local government and potentially even electric infrastructure entities in the United States. An analysis of the behaviors associated with these intrusions indicates pretty strongly that this is likely related to, although we can't completely confirm it, to Berserk Bear actions. So again, showing a pivot from 2019 to the present, from the electric and industrial sectors to being increasingly focused on government and election items through to late 2020. And since then, we just haven't seen that much from this entity. But throughout all of this, other than the asterisks around that German steel mill event, we haven't seen anything like a definitive deliberate destruction event or disruptive event like we can see with other entities associated with Russian interests, such as Sandworm, responsible for another number of disruptive entities, or Fancy Bear, which has leveraged access to election-related entities in order to facilitate disinformation campaigns. So it may seem that Berserk Bear is something less interesting or less serious from a defender's point of view. Well, the thing is that while we certainly see with the other bears that there is an emphasis on things like influencing or infiltrating elections, attempts to disrupt the electric sector, as well as launching things like widespread wiper campaigns, the thing is Berserk Bear, while there are no known deliberate impacts, we do see a consistent history going back over a decade of being able to and successfully accessing a variety of sensitive environments, from oil and gas entities to electric utilities to local and state government entities around election cycles in the United States. And what that shows is that we really have an entity that, while they're not associated with any deliberate sort of destructive events, instead we're seeing an entity that seems to be playing the long game. Because when it comes to evaluating critical infrastructure intrusions and ultimately critical infrastructure attacks, these sorts of items are rarely bolt from the blue events. Instead, they require patient development of capabilities, access, and information about victim environments in order to then generate the flexibility to allow for some sort of disruptive operation in the future. So what we may be seeing with Berserk is not an attempt to try to execute some immediate payoff in terms of network disruption, but rather all of those steps necessary to give some entity the strategic flexibility to launch a disruptive operation in the future at a time of their choosing. So what we're seeing here is that Berserk campaigns enable capability and access development that then give decision makers that are controlling or give Berserk Bear tasking the flexibility to cause some sort of disruptive event in the future based on Berserk's operations. So just because a Berserk Bear operation won't result in immediate disruption in your environment, at least not deliberately, again, asterisks around the steel mill event is a possible outlier, having these entities within your environment shows that there is definite strategic interest in these environments by fairly nasty entities that mean to do them harm, maybe not in any near-term fashion, but certainly in the event of escalating tensions or potentially through the outbreak of armed conflict, that these are marked targets for future impacts or effects. So this is a very short presentation. There is a very long paper that accompanies it that is available in the Virus Bulletin website. So again, if there's a lack of detail or some of the connections in this presentation were not clear, please consult the paper for further details and more in-depth explanation. There is a sampling of some references that were used in the process of creating this presentation here. Again, you'll find a much more extensive bibliography and works cited within the paper itself. So I hope that this was at least interesting, and please, like I said, consult the written work if you're interested in further details. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.